This story takes place in 2006-2007, when I was 5. My mum had a friend who I will call Sarah, and she would come to visit every so often. And from the time she first visited, strange things began to happen. On one occasion when my mum and Sarah were drinking coffee and talking, Sarah looked over to a picture that was displayed on the wall behind my mum and asked, "Who's that picture of?" My mum turned to look and said, "That's my dad when he was in the Air Force during the war." And suddenly the picture came off the wall and the room temperature dropped. My mum is sensitive to the paranormal, so she knows when something's not right. She could tell that there was something strange about Sarah, and it wasn't good. When Sarah left, the entire house felt different. Very different. So my mum had the idea to ask a white witch to come and check out the house. What she told my mum spooked her. Someone had put a curse on the house which allowed negative energy and spirits to latch themselves to the house. There could only be one person that could have done that: Sarah. The white witch told my mum that Sarah was a black witch and gave my mum specific instructions on what to do to get rid of the negative energy. Every night my mum would have to do some sort of spell using candles. Here's where my personal experiences start. One night I went to bed as always, but something strange happened. I had closed the curtains and switched off the lights, and then all of a sudden I hear knocking on my window. Now this isn't possible because my room is on the top floor of the house, and you need a long ladder to reach my window. I opened up my curtains slightly and no one was there. I wasn't scared by this, but just really curious. I shrugged it off and went back to bed. Then the knocking started again. I opened up my curtains a second time to see who was there, and still, no one. I gave up looking out of my window and went back to bed only to feel like I was being watched. In the corner of my room was a door that led to the attic, which had been installed about a year before. As I looked over to the door, I saw a black mist and 2 huge green glowing eyes, about 6 feet off of the ground, looking directly at me, just staring at me. It didn't make a sound, and it didn't move. It just stared at me. I stared back at it, thinking to myself, what the heck is that? After staring for about a minute, I rested my head on the pillow and went to sleep. Sometime during the same night, my mum heard heavy footsteps in my room for about 10 minutes and thought that I was awake. So she went upstairs to my room to check, and there was nothing. I was fast asleep. She shrugged it off and went back to bed. When I woke up in the morning, some of the Lego sets that I kept on my drawers had been smashed onto the floor. I was puzzled as to how it had happened. Later that day, whilst I was at school, my neighbour complained to my mum that I was running in her backyard at 6 a.m. My mum was surprised and confused and told my neighbour that I was asleep at 6 a.m. Later that day, after I got home from school, I saw a boy dressed in early 1900s clothes looking through my door, and then he disappeared. I suspect that he may have been the spirit of a boy that once lived here, and that he was the boy of my neighbour mentioned to my mum. When it was time for me to go to bed, the same thing happened as the night before. Knocking, and then those glowing green eyes in the corner of my room. This continued night after night until at around midnight one time, I rolled over and saw the black mass standing right by my bed, and the green eyes locked with mine, and I quickly closed my eyes so tightly and kept as still as I could and just hoped it would go, and I eventually fell asleep. Whilst all of this was going on, my mum was still doing these nightly spells to get rid of the negative energy, and eventually after several weeks, it lifted. The white witch came over and informed my mum that the bad energy had almost gone, and then the witch did a spell of her own and returned the spell back to Sarah. I guess the spell worked, because shortly after, Sarah had ended up with cancer. About a year after this all took place, my dad was digging a hole in the backyard to make way for something he planned on growing, and we made quite a discovery. In the hole were children's toys from the early 1900s, and as I picked them up I thought back to that boy I saw and began to think that they might have been his. A year later we moved out. We heard that the people who moved in didn't stay for very long because they'd experienced weird things, like we had. Hello all. I had an experience happen to me when I was around 12 or 13 that I had forgotten about and instantly came up in conversation with family. It's about a creature I saw at my grandparents' property. To set the scene, my grandparents live on an 8-acre plot of rectangular land that is gradually sloping upward the whole way. The top half is entirely woods, with the house sitting just below the tree line, giving a pretty good view to the rest of the property below. About 300 yards from the house is an old shed with a creek behind it. The shed sits near a fence, property line, and on the other side is a farm that used to be much bigger, but at the time had 4 or 5 cows roaming around. So I was sitting on a swing on my grandparents' porch, alone, just relaxing and looking at the fields below. Off to my left towards the shed, I noticed this grey-white animal with black spots here and there, walking on all 4 legs. I immediately thought it was one of the cows, as they were known to sometimes cross the fence into the yard. I got up to go tell my grandfather. When I looked back to watch where the cow was walking to, it then walked to the shed, raised itself off of its front legs onto only its back legs, and just leaned on the shed. I thought that was odd, until it turned its head in my direction. Even with the distance between us, I got immediate chills, and this overpowering feeling that I just knew it, somehow, was staring right back at me. I turned around and ran into the house, told my grandfather, and came back outside. It was no more than 1 minute from the time I left to going back outside, and it was gone. No trace of it, and no cows anywhere near the fence. I told my grandfather what I saw it do, and he chuckled. He told me that I had a nice imagination, and then that was the end of it. It terrified me so much at the time that I tried to put it out of my mind, but I still get goosebumps just thinking about it. Does this sound familiar to anyone? Or does anyone know of any stories or legends about the similar sounding creatures? I just finished editing this post. I attempted to fix all typos and grammar inconsistencies, as well as adding to some details of the original post. I had been so shaken up when I first typed these memories out 4 days ago that when I finished I had to proofread it. I'm a 32-year-old man, yet it is broad daylight as I write this post, because what I'm about to share haunts me to this day, to the point that merely thinking about it, or in this case typing this memory, is enough to send chills down my body and make me feel like a terrified child. I have only told this story to a handful of people over the past 10 years because of how terrifying an experience it was for me, but I feel like it can be therapeutic to get it off my chest and share it with others. Maybe others have had a similar experience, and if so, please let me know. To tell this story and give it justice, I have to tell you of an experience that happened 3 years before. Buckle up, as this will be a long post, but definitely not boring. My name is Joshua, but I would change the names to protect the privacy of the others involved in this story. I live in Arkansas, and in late 2003, near the middle of fall, right before it started getting really cold, my wife and I were invited to camp with a friend of mine and his girlfriend at Sugarloaf Lake in Oklahoma. I say camp, but the actual plan was to meet at Sugarloaf, and my friend, we will call him Bob, wanted to take me and my wife around to some paranormal places in the Sugarloaf area. So we got there around 7 p.m. I was driving a white Ford 1996 F-150. Bob was driving something from 1980, a white Celebrity. It was really a piece of crap vehicle, but anyway, it was late dusk, becoming dark, so we all climbed into Bob's car and he took us around the area. First to an old abandoned house, but other than some raccoons rustling around, it was a 2-hour waste of time. Then he took us to a graveyard that was supposed to be haunted. Again, a bust. Then an old church that was run down and supposed to be haunted. Once again. Yawn. At this point it was getting close to midnight and my wife and I were getting pretty bored, and I spoke up to Bob saying, "Man, this really hasn't been that freaky of a night." That's when Bob smiled and said he was saving the best for last. He handed me a Polaroid picture of a hillside covered in trees in daylight. I asked him what it was and he asked me if I'd seen a house or any type of light pole in the picture, to which I replied no. He took the picture back and said that's because there isn't, and there are no power lines either. He then turned down an old dirt road and passed a small house. After that it was 2 miles of dirt road with woods on one side and a barbed wire fence on the other, with about 2 acres of field connecting to a wooded hillside. Nothing to light the night except the full moon above and the clear starry night. After what seemed like forever, he stopped the car and told us all to get out. We did as he asked, and he walked us to the side of the car where the fence, field and wooded hillside was. He looked at his cell phone and neither of our phones had any signal. This was 2003 and this area had no cell towers, but he looked at his phone and said it was 11:57 and told us all to watch the middle of the hillside. Even in the complete darkness I could tell this was the same field and hillside from the picture. 2 minutes go by and nothing has changed. Then at exactly midnight a small light flickers on in the middle of the hillside. As my wife, Bob, his girlfriend and myself watch as this small light, which to me looked like an old kerosene lantern, began to move, swaying back and forth. We stood and watched in complete silence for what seemed like several minutes, when I finally spoke up and asked what the story was with this. Bob replied he didn't know, but the locals had told him that at midnight every night, this lantern will light up and sway back and forth through the woods until the sun comes up and it disappears. Nobody knew what the story was. At the time I was a 19-year-old guy who didn't think anything would scare me or hurt me, so since there was no houses around I yelled out, "We see you! Wow, you are so scary with your little lantern." Bob shushed me, but it was too late. My wife screamed and pointed. I was laughing, but my laughing stopped as I looked back toward the hillside to see the lantern swaying back and forth, but moving down the hillside to a field at an inhumane pace. Gliding, it began to speed across the field towards our car. We didn't stick around to see what it was, because within seconds we were in the car and flying down the dirt road back to the lake. We looked back to see the lantern moving slowly back up the hillside to where it had first appeared. The ride back was silent, until Bob spoke up and told us he'd forgotten to put gas in the car earlier. Forgotten to put gas in the car earlier, and the only store around is closed. If we decided to go back out anywhere, it'd be best to take my truck until he could get gas in the morning, as he only had about half a quarter tank. I agreed, and a few minutes later we arrived back at Sugarloaf Lake. We had parked by the lake docks and we dropped my tailgate and sat and talked about what had just happened. Bob's girlfriend was pregnant at the time and told him she was hungry. He told her we had brought some snacks, but she said she needed actual food. But since the local store was closed, he asked if we could take my truck to the next town over to get some food, as his car wouldn't have enough gas to get us to that town. I obliged. We shut our cooler, put the tailgate up and loaded into my truck. I turned the key and nothing happened. My truck was dead. Deader than dead. No ding, no lights, no clicking noise, nothing. For all intents and purposes, you would think the alternator was out. This was strange, and after the night we'd had, it made us all feel uneasy. We got out of the truck and popped the hood, pulled Bob's car around to the front and attempted to jump-start my truck with his car. This is where it gets even weirder. As soon as we connect the jumper cables to his battery and back to mine, his girlfriend starts his car, and within seconds the cables in between the connectors start to smoke, and in a flash of fire they burn up within seconds. The cables were nothing more than bits of melted rubber and ash with only the end clamps still on our batteries. Bob runs and turns off his car and we take the clamps off our batteries. We look at each other in the eerie moon and starlit night. Did I mention there were no light poles around, and we both get a bad feeling at the exact same time, as we suddenly realize we had been hearing a distant noise in the lake that was getting louder. It was a boat motor. Like I said, it was the time of year where it was starting to get cold, especially at night. We were bundled up as it was, and we were standing still on land at night, but somebody was out on a boat after midnight, when it had to be chilly as all get out with the wind hitting them, and from the sound of this motor it was going pretty fast. But we saw nothing. That is until the boat was about 50 yards away, and a very bright spotlight comes on, temporarily blinding us all. Bob and I tell the women to get in his car and lock the doors. I reach into the bed of my truck and give Bob a tire tool, and I pick up another. We are standing in front of the vehicles in the middle, hoods up on both. As the boat pulls up to the dock, two heavily bearded men in their 30s to 40s step out of the boat and walk up. It's hard to give an accurate description as their spotlight was still pointed at us, and it covered the men in an eerie shadow whilst blinding Bob and I. They look at us and our vehicles, and one glances in the direction of the car at the women, then back at us. Then he lets out a small chuckle. "You fellas got some sort of car trouble?" one asks as he lights up a cigarette. "Yeah, and it's nothing we can't handle," I stammer. The guy with the cigarette sniffs the air and looks down between Bob and I's feet and sees the still smoking ashes of what was the jumper cable. "Looks like it was more than your pussy jumper cables could handle. You all need some help? We got some tools on the boat that I think I can fix you guys' problems right up." Then the other man who had chuckled in the beginning says, "Fix them right up." I'm speechless at this moment, probably with my mouth hanging open, I can't remember, as the two men walk back to their boat and we hear what sounds like chains rattling around as we try to make out what they were doing, but the spotlight is so blinding we can barely see. But the chain noise was enough. Bob looked at me, and without saying a word, we both jumped in his car and drove the fuck out of there. For the next few hours, we drove to a populated area of houses, which wasn't many in the rural area we were pretty much stuck in, since we had very little fuel. We all sat in the car, mostly quiet, looking around in all directions in near panic, thinking at any time those men would find us. Bob would turn his lights on every now and then, thinking he had seen some movement in the dark. After a while, the women fell asleep, and Bob and I talked about how fucking weird this whole ordeal had been, and he laughs and says, "I told you it would be a scary night. I just didn't know it would be this sort of scary." At this point, the paranormal lantern wasn't even the main thing freaking me out. The men never showed, and eventually the morning was on its way. It was about 20 minutes until sunrise, and Bob asked if I wanted to go see if the lantern really disappears at sunrise. I asked if he was sure he had enough gas, and he said yeah. The local store opens up in about an hour, so we'll be fine. I tell him in that case, okay. We wake the women up and drive back to that hillside. We get there with about 4 minutes left until sunrise. We still see the lantern swaying in the woods. Bob looks at me and I smile and do the motion for zipping my lips, and we all watch in wonder as right at sunrise, the lantern slowly fades away to nothing. After this, we get back in the car and drive back to the lake, feeling a lot safer now. When we get there, there is no sign of the boat, and the hood of my truck is still up, and the doors are still locked. On a whim, I tell Bob I'm going to try to start the truck one more time before he drives us somewhere where I can get a cell signal and call for help. And I'll be damned, the truck started right up with no hesitation or problem. We all went our separate ways, happy to have seen the sunrise, and counting our blessings and swearing to leave the paranormal investigating in this area to others, swearing that we never wanted to come back to this area and run into those boat guys again. However, all things fade with time, even fear and common sense. 3 years later, Bob, who I haven't seen in almost 2 years at that point, calls me up and says he has a proposition for me. He goes on to tell me he has a group consisting of himself and 3 other Wiccans who go out and do seances in haunted places, and asks me if I would be willing to film their sessions in the haunted places for their records, and that they would pay me well for my services. I am no Wiccan, but I have always loved the paranormal, even after what I went through at Sugarloaf. I still had an itch to scratch when it came to getting scared and dealing with the paranormal and the unknown, and I told him yes, I would love to film for them. I told him I had no interest in joining in, and that I was okay with watching and just getting to be out there looking into the paranormal again. So of course my next question was when and where are we going to be doing it? When he answered me, I got a terrible gut feeling, and I wished so much that I had trusted my gut and had told him I had changed my mind. "Remember that lantern light out near Sugarloaf?" he asked me, as if there was any way I could forget. "Yeah," I stammered. "Why do you ask?" I told my group the story, and they want to do the ritual there and see if we can contact the spirit and find out why it was there and what it wants, Bob replied. "I don't know, man," I said. "Oh, come on, Josh. Trust me, you'll be fine, and I'm going to pay you $250 just to sit there and film it," he retorted. At the time, I was about to become a father, and money was tight because of diapers, formula, and the like. Cost a small fortune. Not to mention it was my first kid. Not to mention it was my first kid and my wife's first kid, so she had been going crazy spending money on not just the necessities, but also buying only top-of-the-line baby products. So because my wife was putting us in the poorhouse, I had to weigh out my fear of the area he wanted to go back to with how important it was I make all the extra money I could. So against my better judgment, I accepted the offer, and a week later I was in the same beaten-down celebrity Bob was driving 3 years before. But this time with Bob and 2 guys and a girl that were complete strangers to me. They were each dressed in gothic clothing and had these pentagram necklaces, or something of the sort. It was 11:50 when we got there. Then 4 of them sat in a tight circle, and I was positioned behind them to the right, about 5 feet from the barbed wire fence that was in front of the field that led to the hillside. My back was to the hillside and the bushes were at the fence line, and I was filming my friend's circle as they all started chanting something. As I have been typing this entire post, I have been getting knots in my stomach, knowing that I was coming to this part of the story. This part haunts my dreams and even waking hours to this day. I am going to do my best to describe how the following events unfolded, though I know mere words cannot do justice to the pure terror that ensued, or how horribly horrific the events sounded and were. So when reading or listening to this, turn your imagination all the way up, and believe me when I say up to this point in my life, I was interested in the paranormal. It was a fun hobby to go and ghost hunting or get myself spooked or whatever. But after this night, I never look at the paranormal as fun or interesting anymore. I show it respect and stay as far away as possible. As much as I dread it, I will now finish telling this story. As his group is chanting, Bob lights up this huge candle in the middle of them and opens up some sort of book. It's not like a scary antique spell book or anything. It looks like a newer hardcover. Anyway, he starts reciting words from it, and then he looks at his phone. And tells his group to be quiet and to look at the hill. I turn the camera, and at midnight on the dot, the lantern once again appears. One member of Bob's group blurts out, "Cool." I rolled my eyes, since the way these people were dressed and the way they carried themselves, the word cool didn't seem to fit in their vocabulary. Then Bob says to his group to join hands as they attempt to communicate with the spirit. I turn my back to the light and begin to film the group as they begin again chanting, and Bob reads from the book. Then they start asking questions, in hopes the spirit will respond. Around about this time, a wind picks up and Bob's candle goes out. He tells everyone to hold on and tells me to cut the camera for a minute. I oblige and stop recording and watch as Bob tries his lighter. Then another 2 lighters offered from his group, but none of the lighters are working. I'm sitting down watching the group when I start hearing a rustling behind me. I jump up, leaving the camera on the ground, and spin around. Bob and his group are preoccupied with their candle and lighter problem, and as I spin around, I'm blinded by the brightest light I have ever seen. What I believe was the lantern up close and personal, but as quick as it appears, the light is gone and the lantern is nowhere to be seen. If it had been the lantern that blinded me, it had moved from the hillside across the field and right behind me, with me not realizing it within the span of maybe 30 seconds. I look around for the lantern on the hillside, and nothing. It's only 12:15 or so, and the light has always stayed until sunrise. At this moment the wind quits blowing, and I hear Bob's lighter finally flick, and I see it light up. I mutter, guys, did you see that?" They all turn to me and ask what I was talking about. But before I could answer them, we all are stopped dead in our tracks by a distant laughter coming from seemingly nowhere and everywhere around us. It was distant at the moment, and this is no ordinary laughter. This laughter sounds like the laughter of hundreds, maybe even thousands of children. As I type this, I am looking around the room I am in. Whenever I think or talk about this experience, I can vividly remember that terrifying sound and hear it in my head. Also, it just occurred to me that if you put the letter S at the beginning of laughter, it spells slaughter. Ugh, why did I just think that? The best way I can describe this laughter is for you to imagine listening to a large group of kids singing "Row, row, row your boat." You know how one kid will start, and seconds later another will join in, starting at beginning of song, and so on and so forth. Well, this sounded like that. Like as if one would start laughing, and seconds later another. And that pattern went on in an endless loop. It was now getting louder and closer. There was sinister laughing, goofy laughing, giggling all around us, coming from all directions. I was shaking. I couldn't move. I was spinning around and around, looking off into the distance. This couldn't be real. This sort of thing doesn't happen. What the fuck was happening? I scream at Bob and his group that we need to get the fuck out of there, but they're already running for the car, leaving their Wiccan book and candle behind. Without hesitation, I run after them and jump into the car just as the laughter is becoming deafening. We haul ass out of there, drive about a mile up the road and pull over as Bob is in no condition to drive as he's freaking out so much. We're all freaking out. We all get out of the car and start pacing around, asking each other if we really heard what we just heard. I tell Bob that I'm sorry, but I left his camera behind. He says he doesn't care and that he isn't going back for it either. At this point I had my hands on my knees, panting, trying to catch my breath, as I've never in my life been so terrified. That is when all of our chatter stops as we once again hear the laughter off in the distance. It's quiet at first, but slowly it gets closer and closer and louder, until once again it is becoming deafening. We jumped back in the car and sped away. We drove for about 6 miles, and for the first 3 miles we could all still hear the laughter in the distance. With our windows down a little, we all begin to calm down a bit. By the 4th mile we could no longer hear the laughter. Despite this, we had no intention of pulling over again, and Bob's friend was sat in the passenger seat with his phone, waiting for a signal to pop up. At about mile 6, Bob's friend suddenly says, "Hey, I've got full bars." And he hands the phone to Bob to call a friend of his who is into the occult, is well versed and educated in it, and as we are driving he is describing what happened to the lady. Bob later told me his friend told him she believed it was the children of Hecate or something like that. I have no idea what Hecate is, but it sounded like more of a guess to me. Anyway, as Bob is on the phone speeding out of the area, me and the 2 others in the back seat all get a chill at the same time, and they tell me later that just like me, the hair on the back of their neck stood up as a loud snapping noise came from the front end of the car, and Bob's celebrity stopped dead in its tracks and will no longer move forward. He tried everything, but the car didn't move. We later discovered that a tie rod had snapped. Bob was talking to his friend on the phone. She only lived about 20 minutes away from where we were, and they said they were on their way. As we sat in the car, nobody spoke a word, and after around 3 minutes we saw a pair of headlights coming down the road towards us. We knew it was too soon to be Bob's friend, but me and Bob thought maybe we could get a ride from a local, so we all unloaded out of the car and stood in front of it, waiting on the vehicle to stop. Now I can't be certain, but my gut tells me I'm correct in saying that the vehicle didn't stop, and as it comes into view, we can see it's a beat-up old pickup truck. It starts to slow down, and we can see there are 2 men inside, in their 30s to 40s, with huge beards. They stare at us as they pass, then speed off. I look at Bob, and before I say anything, he says what I was already thinking. It was the guys from the boat. Again I go to speak, but I'm interrupted by the sight of the same headlights, coming from the direction the truck had just gone. We became still and silent as the same guys in the same truck again passed by slowly, staring at us. Bob called his friend again and told her to drive like hell and get here now. 4 or 5 minutes go by and we see the headlights coming. Relieved, we all get our stuff and get ready to jump in the car, thinking it is Bob's friend. Then his phone rings. It was the lady who was coming to get us, telling Bob she took a wrong turn and is going to be 10 or 15 minutes more before she gets there. Bob hangs up the phone and watches in terror, as I do, as the same truck slowly passes by again, this time with only one of them in the truck. The driver slows to a crawl and says, "Looks like you fellas could use some help." Then he speeds up and drives off. This cemented the fact to Bob and I that we were definitely dealing with the boat guys. But where the hell did the other guy go? Why wasn't he in the passenger seat? And to make matters worse at this point, something we had almost completely forgotten about due to all this Boatmen headlight stuff, was that we were immediately reminded of the laughter. We are starting to hear it again off in the distance and all around us, just as before. Over the next few minutes it started getting closer and closer. I am almost pissing my pants at this point, as the sound is getting deafeningly loud, and we have nowhere to run this time. Then from behind our car, off in the distance, we see 2 sets of headlights come on, and 2 vehicles coming towards us slowly, side by side, taking up the entire width of the road. The laughter now seems to be coming from the woods on both sides of the road we are on, and the laughing seems to be honing in on us as if hundreds or thousands of children are within reaching distance. There is no wind and no sound other than the crunch of the tyres on the rocky dirt road of the 2 vehicles slowly driving towards us. With a last shred of hope fading away into the laughter of the children and the headlights of the 2 vehicles surely being driven by the boatmen, we are given a reprieve, as this time, coming from the other direction, was another set of headlights, and they were coming fast. We held our breath. The laughter, the boatmen. What could be next? How will we get out of this? And that's when the vehicle that was coming fast pulls up. It's Bob's friend. She unlocks the doors on her car and rolls down her windows. She begins to tell us to get in, when the 2 sets of headlights coming from the other direction suddenly go off, and Bob's friend says, "Oh my God, you weren't kidding about the laughing kids." She screams at us to get in, so we do it as fast as we can. We begin to tell her about the boat guys as she turns the car around. She begins to drive away, and no sooner had she done this, the 2 sets of headlights come on again, full beam, and startle us. They are about a car's length behind us as we are all crammed in. I yell to our driver, "Go, go, go!" channeling my inner Jeff Goldblum, telling her we must go faster. She floors it, and for about a mile the 2 vehicles are on our ass. Then they turn off onto a side road. For about the next 2 miles after that, we can all still hear the laughter way off into the distance with our windows open. After about 3 miles, the laughter was gone. To this day, I have no explanation as to what happened, what the laughing children were, why the laughing followed us, and if the boatmen were connected to all this somehow, or if it was merely a coincidence that they happened to terrify us at the same time as the paranormal stuff was going on. And if that is the case, why did they not react to the laughing children's sound? Is the lantern connected to the laughing children, or did Bob and his group mistakenly call forth the laughing children through their ritual? Like I said, this happened years ago, but I still feel just as terrified now when I tell people about it or think about it. I had constant chills and goosebumps as I was writing this. To all of you who think the paranormal is just a fun hobby to get your thrills with, I beg of you and I warn you that we are not prepared for what is really out there. You think nothing will scare or harm you, but you are dealing with unknown things. You have no idea how powerful or mundane the paranormal can be. The scariest thing that ever happened to me came from the person closest to me. My ex-husband and I were both only 19 when we married. When we first met, everything was glorious. I moved in with him and his family, as me and mine were having a lot of trouble at the time, and for the first year, all was golden. Then one day his stepdad went missing. The police found his body almost a week later, murdered. The tragedy tore through the 3 of them, Nikki, his mother, and sister, with an intensity similar to a massive hurricane. If Nikki's biological father had been present, that might have been one thing, but that piece of human excrement was not just absent, but only made the occasional appearance to steal one of the kids' social security checks from the mail on arrival, and that was usually when he knew no one would be home. When Fiona married Dave, he became their father, the only father they had. He became their true family. After the homicide, Nikki's whole personality shifted towards darkness. He would rant and rave like a man possessed and become violent if I didn't do everything he told me to do, no matter what it was. To this day I have scars from a physical altercation with his sister on being commanded to attack her and having no choice but to do so. The scars make me who I am now, a survivor, but I wouldn't wish what I went through on anyone. Being terrified for your life every single day and never knowing if any given moment could lead to your last is exhausting and traumatizing to say the least. One day we got into a fight so badly that I told him I wanted a divorce. He kicked me out of my own car at my parents' house and tore out of the driveway, spraying gravel everywhere and leaving puffs of dust floating up toward the sky. I was utterly distraught by the entire situation at that point and was completely at my wit's end. Yet for some reason I still loved him, still wanted to make things work out, and for us to stay together. So when he called and begged for the chance to just talk things over, of course I agreed and went outside to anxiously wait for him to return and pick me up. I expected him to have calmed down by the time he'd arrived. At least that was what his tone had suggested over the phone. But when I got in the car, the whole vibe felt off. The tension was almost physically too much to handle. We rode in silence for about 5 minutes before he shot me a quick glare, then returned his attention to the road. His dark eyes drilled right through me, their anger giving off a certain glint like that of coal. "You know you're my wife, right?" he asked in a syrupy, sickly sweet voice. "That means you belong to me." I didn't really know how to respond, so I said nothing. My mind turned 1,000 miles an hour, deciphering what he was telling me though. His level of possessiveness over me had steadily increased in the past 6 months or so after Dave's death, as if he were terrified of me disappearing along with the glue that had held his tiny little broken family together. My subconscious screamed at me that the whole thing had been a ruse, a trick to lure me back into the car. I looked down at my hands in my lap, wringing them together until my knuckles turned red. "I thought you wanted to fix things," I said. He smirked and my gut went cold, my worst fears confirmed in that twisted, psychotic expression of his. "What do you think this is?" he replied. "It feels like a trick," I told him. He pursed his lips together, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. His shoulders tensed and his expression grew more malevolent than ever. "That's because it was a trick," he murmured. "If I can't have you, no one can." Until the moment he said the words aloud, I always thought of that expression as one of those you only ever hear or read in fiction. It never occurred to me that there was a reason it existed. Someone, or many others most likely, who had heard the phrase and felt the sheer horror that accompanied its implication. In the course of our relationship, I endured punches, kicks, rape, 2 total cars, and multiple death threats. A couple of weeks after this incident, I finally managed to get away from him for good. I stayed the night at a friend's house after getting what little things I needed. She lived not far from his grandparents, but I didn't really think anything of it, because the neighbourhood is one of those upscale, quiet, safe kind of suburbs. We partied most of the night. She went upstairs to sleep around 1 and left me on the couch in the living room watching TV, willing myself to pass out. About an hour later, around 2 a.m, I felt like someone was watching me. I looked over at the sliding doors to my left that led out into the backyard. There he was. He was standing outside in the dark, in the rain, watching me, and crying with his fists clenched. I felt my eyes grow wide and I sank slowly down into the leather cushions, as if they would make me disappear from sight. I don't know how much longer he was there. When I looked again, he was gone. The next day when my mum came to get me, because he wrecked my car so I no longer had a ride, he was standing at the corner staring at her as she drove past. We had to get a police escort to take us straight to the station to get a restraining order. I spent the next year getting the divorce straightened out and getting the rest of my belongings that he was trying to hold hostage, like my birth certificate, diploma, and social security card. I spent the next 6 years, even after entering into a wonderful and truly loving relationship, in fear that he would come for me. Even now, 8 years later, sometimes he will still try to contact me through other people or fake accounts on social media. Sometimes the most unsuspecting person is the one you have to worry about. Sometimes all it takes is one tragedy to twist a person completely inside and turn them into a monster on the outside. This was really a long series of scary stories rolled into one, I suppose, and I apologize for any long-windedness. Those were the most horrifying experiences of my life thus far, and I hope to never have any that might equal them. I was driving home from work a couple of hours ago and I saw something that I yet to find a explanation for. Out of my peripheral, I saw a dark animal-like shape moving towards my car. I looked over at it and saw what looked like a large ball of fur running on 4 legs. The movement made me think of a rabbit, but the size seemed only slightly smaller than a medium-sized dog. I was going about 40 to 45 miles per hour at that point and didn't slow down at first because I thought it was too far away to have the possibility of crossing the road and hitting my car. Then it ran into the ditch and I lost it, so I slammed on my brakes just to be safe. I was still looking out of the driver's side window, and for a split second there was nothing. I turned my head to the front and saw what I can only describe as a dark mass with bird wings fly across my windshield. The size and shape seemed to be exactly like the thing that was running, except now it had large bird wings as well. I've been sitting here for the past 2 hours thinking of any way to explain it, and the best I've come up with is that the first thing was a very furry dog, and the second happened to be an owl that crossed my windshield at a very coincidental moment. Any explanation is appreciated.